When you're talking about the mammalian brain, it's not just one structure altogether. There's a lot of connections, there's a lot of individual parts that work together to allow a fully functional individual. Now, the biggest portion of the brain you're going to see on this model is going to be the cortex. Now, the cerebrum, the cerebral cortex, is the center of motion, sensory information, and executive function. So in humans, it's the biggest portion. But it's not the only portion. And it's right here in this brown area, we're seeing the cerebellum. Cerebellum means small brain. This part of the cerebellum here is underneath the cerebrum, and it allows you for a lot of the coordination of motion. There's also the brainstem. So the brainstem here is going to connect the cerebrum all the way down to the spinal cord. So spinal cord coming down here, brainstem up here. And lastly, it's going to be the diencephalon. Now the diencephalon includes a lot of things that are inside the cortex, inside the brain. So if this is my cerebrum, this is my brainstem, and this is my cerebellum, this area right here is going to be the diencephalon, everything in the centermost portion. So this section right here is going to be the thalamus, and this section right here by the pituitary gland is going to be the hypothalamus. So thalamus, hypothalamus. So let's talk about all of these together, one at a time. Let's talk about the cerebrum, the diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem. With the cerebrum, there are going to be lobes to it. Lobes are divided up to what they do. There are going to be 5 lobes, similar to the same lobes that you talk about with the bones of the skull. So the most anterior portion is the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe does executive function, meaning for planning, personality, advanced thinking, problem solving. They're all going to be in the frontal lobe. And then when you get to the back side, this is going to be where most of your motor functions are going to be. So this right here is going to be my pre-central gyrus. I'm looking over here. A gyri is going to be a lumpy area of the brain. It curves deep and down and forms this wavy portion of the brain. So the gyrus is the above portions, and the sulcus is going to be the pit or the divot in between the gyri. This allows you to have a lot of surface area as they fold on top of each other. So with this one, number 5, being the sulcus, this is going to be the border between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. The frontal lobe does executive function and planning. And then also here on 6, this is going to be the gyrus that's going to be before the central sulcus, so the pre-central gyrus. This does motor functions. So all of your motor functions, whether that be foot, hand, or face, are going to be combined in this gyrus. When there's a stroke in this area, then you're going to have paralysis of the body part. So this is my central sulcus. In between it, the next one you're going to have is the parietal lobe. So parietal lobe is going to be this section. It does a lot of the sensory information. So when you feel a pinprick, when you're feeling a sensation like pain, temperature, or touch, if you were to put a nickel into your hand versus a quarter, you can feel the differences, you can feel the pressure, the weight, the size, and that's going to be relayed information to this parietal lobe for you to determine, okay, it's a quarter because it's large, it has rough edges, and it's going to be different from a nickel with those smooth edges. The next thing you're going to notice is going to be the occipital lobes. Occipital lobes do vision. So what happens if you get hit in the back of the head very hard, you have risk of damaging that brain. And it doesn't matter if your eyes are working. It doesn't matter if the optic nerve is working. It's because if that optic region is damaged, then you've lost the ability to interpret vision. So you've lost vision. The 4th lobe is going to be the temporal lobe. So just like your temporal bone is on the sides of your head, the temporal lobe is going to be here. This does hearing and smell. So the example, this one is going to be a nerve, an olfactory nerve. It runs down and it's going to join with this frontal lobe in order for you to be able to smell. Hearing is also found in here. If I were to pry that lobe outward and look deep inside the cortex, inside that cerebrum, you would find a fifth lobe called the insula. Now the insula is what's going to allow you to taste. It has a gustatory sense. You have two hemispheres for your cerebrum, a left and a right. Left and a right. They're held together and they're separated by this corpus, by this a longitudinal fissure. They're not completely separated because there are paths between them. For example, if I open this up, this white right here is going to be some axons, some myelinated axons is going to go from one side of the hemisphere to the other. This is called the corpus callosum. You're seeing one on either side because it's a pathway that's going to go from one part of the hemisphere to the other. Next is going to be the diencephalon. So the diencephalon is made of many parts. I'm going to talk about two of them. One being the thalamus, the other one being the hypothalamus. So the thalamus, you receive thousands and hundreds of thousands of signals from all nerves all over your body, from allowing you to hear things, sounds of different sounds, being able to feel different sensation, the clothes on your back, the sensation on your feet. All of that has to be translated somewhere. You don't want to be sensory overloaded. You only want to be conscious of the important stuff. So that's what the thalamus does. It screens out information, screens out sensory information, so only a small part of it gets to the cerebrum for you to be able to sense it. That's the thalamus. The next portion is going to be the hypothalamus, right down here, with the pituitary gland here. So the hypothalamus is related to the thalamus, but it's largely controlled the endocrine system of the body. The pituitary gland here does a lot of things with the long-term regulation of hormones. Sex hormones like estrogen, testosterone, growth hormone, thyroid hormone, cortisol. All of those are regulated by the thalamus, by the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Body temperature is also regulated. Fever is regulated here. Thirst, hunger are also regulated here. So it has a lot of functions to it. Now with the cerebellum, down to here, this you can see a cross section. So if this was the entire section, cerebellum is also divided up into hemispheres, and you can separate it. And you see several different nervous pathways. You see several axons and pathways going between that and the brainstem. And there's going to be connections from the brainstem and the cerebellum to the cerebrum. All of this over here. So if that does balance and coordination. So if I'm testing my cerebellum, it's about coordination. Like for example, when you're getting pulled over for drunk driving, hopefully you haven't, but if you do, they're usually going to have you do this test where you walk heel to toe. It takes a lot of coordination and balance to do this. With your cerebellum impaired, you usually have to broaden your gait and kind of steady yourself broadly because you're going to fall over otherwise. You can also have spasms or shaking in your cerebellum if that's damaged. And as long as that's intact, then you can have nice, smooth motion. The most primitive part of the brain is going to be the brainstem. It controls a lot of life-preserving features, like it does breathing, helps regulate your heart rate, does reflexes like gagging, swallowing, pupillary reflexes. All of them are going to be in this brainstem. If that brainstem is no longer functioning, that's brain death, and there's no recovery from that. So with your brainstem is made of 3 parts. First part over here is going to be your midbrain. You can kind of see that as 32. It's going to be your midbrain. It's going to run between the thalamus and the cerebrum as it's passing information towards the higher brain functions. The other two, the pons and the medulla, they have important what's called respiratory centers. So when you're breathing, when you hold your breath, you can't hold your breath indefinitely. Eventually, you do have to breathe. So eventually, because the brainstem is overriding your ability to consciously control it, and so that's going to cause you to spontaneously breathe. So the pons does that. The medulla also does that. There's also several portions for your cranial nerves. Your nerves have several places. There are nerves that innervate your face, eyes, tongue, and they're all coming from that brainstem. You can see them kind of jutting out here. They're as if they've been cut. So these are called cranial nerves. Most of them are coming off that brainstem. So like when you're talking about a fixed and dilated pupil, if you shine a light in someone's eyes, their pupil is supposed to constrict. But if it doesn't, then that might be a problem with the brainstem because that nerve should be contracting to decrease the light if you shine light in someone's eyes. So that's a really bad sign. Nerves like your facial nerve, which is going to innervate all of your facial expression muscles. Nerves like your olfactory nerve, like here, that's going to innervate for your sense of smell, passes through the parts of the brain, so that's a cranial nerve, and the rest of them are out through here. So that's some of the functions of that brainstem. Midbrain, pons, medulla. Midbrain, pons, medulla. The brain is not completely solid all throughout like this model. There are passageways, there are chambers that are going to produce the fluid surrounding the brain, the cerebral spinal fluid, and it's going to be created in these chambers and fluctuate and pass all the way through the circulation as it's going through the brain. This is a casting of what those ventricles look like. It's a larger scale. Your real brains don't look this large. But you can see that if you molded those chambers, this is what they would look like. Now there's 4 chambers. The first 2 are called the lateral ventricles, and that's what you can kind of see on this diagram, if you can kind of zoom in there. It's not the best view. But these are going to be your lateral ventricles. They produce fluid. They drain into this portion, which is your third ventricle, and that's what you're seeing right here. There is a connection point between your left and right thalamus as it passes through there. You're going to have a tunnel, an aqueduct that passes to the fourth ventricle, which is going to be between the brainstem and the cerebellum. So it flows from lateral ventricle, third ventricle, cerebral aqueduct, fourth ventricle. And then from there it goes down to the brain, goes down and feeds the spinal cord, and then it gets circulated and drained back into the venous supply as that fluid is retaken up into the sinuses of the brain. Now that we've seen the human brain and the model, now we want to go ahead and take a look at a preserved brain. This is a sheep's brain. You'll notice it is quite a bit smaller. Another thing to notice that the tip of the brain is going to go straight, so the spinal cord is going to be coming from the anterior to from posterior to anterior, and then this is going to be my spinal cord. There's my anterior brain versus a human's would go like this with the brain with the cord going upward and then curving into the brain. But sheeps don't stand upright, but they still have the same basic features. These would be your cerebrum, cerebellum, brainstem, and then we'll see the diencephalon when we cut into it. So the lobes of the brain are going to be the same. Frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. We're not going to see the insula on this one either. So again, frontal, parietal, occipital, temporal. This is your cerebellum. Has that cauliflower look to it. Same thing with humans, it requires balance and coordination. And then here we're seeing the brain stem. This right here is your midbrain, pons, medulla. a sagittal cut of the sheep, so it went from left and right. So if we're looking at a cross section, now we're able to see the other structures we weren't able to see before. Like for example here, we're going to see the thalamus. So the thalamus is going to be above here, and then it's going to project here. The hypothalamus is going to be here. So thalamus, hypothalamus. It's kind of harder to see with this one, but you can kind of get the general idea that this is my cerebrum and this is my thalamus, hypothalamus. Now I said that the hemispheres of the brains come together. So in this one we're seeing this structure right here. That's my corpus callosum. It connects my left and right hemispheres. And then here was the opening for my ventricle. So this was the opening for the lateral ventricle. You see my probes going in there pretty deep. So it's a big ventricle that goes down through there. This is my cerebellum. You see the white matter going like a Christmas tree, like little branches of a tree all over the place. Here we're seeing the pons. You see the increase here, and then the medulla down here. So midbrain, pons, medulla. So this is a coronal cut, an anterior-posterior cut of the cerebrum. So this was my cerebrum. Here's my longitudinal fissure between them. This one you're able to see the ventricles a lot more. So here's my corpus callosum connecting my left and right together. Here's my ventricles, spaces. These would be my lateral ventricles. On this one, you're able to see the thalamus a bit more. So right here is going to be my thalamus on either side. It looks slightly more gray than the surrounding whiter matter. And that's the defining feature of that one, corpus callosum, lateral ventricles, thalamus. You can kind of see on this one as well. Thalamus, corpus callosum.